A woman in silk gloves leans forward. She's laughing, not unkindly, just entertained. In front of her, a man is chained by the neck to a post. He's been there for years. He hasn't said anything in a while. She pokes him with the tip of her fan just to see if he'll react. This isn't a horror film set. This happened every week for over 100 years, and the wealthiest, most fashionable people in London paid good money to be there. You know it by its other name. Somewhere between a hospital and a tourist attraction, this place became one of the most popular days out in the entire British Empire. Not despite the suffering inside it, because of it. So here's the question that should be bothering you right now. Why would the richest, most civilized people in the world line up to watch this? Say the word Bedlam today and everyone knows what you mean. A crowded train platform, a chaotic classroom, a group chat spiraling out of control. Almost nobody pictures a real address. But there is one. There always was. Bethlem Royal Hospital, and founded in 1247 as a priory. By the late 1300s, it had already become what it's remembered for, a place to house the insane. But here's the part that got buried. You could walk up to that gate, hand over a coin, stand watch real humans suffering as a weekend activity. That's the part of the word's history that got buried. But the most complicated story, a painter who kept creating from inside those walls, would take decades to tell. We'll come back to him. By the 1700s, the hospital had relocated to a new building in Moorfields, designed by Robert Hooke, one of the sharpest scientific minds of the age. Wide corridors, tall windows, an entrance that looked less like a hospital and more like a mansion. That wasn't an accident. This building wasn't just designed to house patients. It was designed to be looked at. Here's the transaction stripped down to its rawest form. You walk up, you hand over a penny, less than the price of a loaf of bread, and you walk through the gate. On the other side, real people in the middle of the worst days of their lives, on full display. Historians estimate this single building pulled in tens of thousands of visitors annually. That's tourist attraction numbers. In a century before tourist attractions really existed as a concept. So why? Why would anyone want this? Because in Georgian London, there was no real framework for mental illness, no concept of trauma, no psychiatric care as we'd understand it. There were essentially two available diagnoses, melancholia and raving. That was the entire medical vocabulary for human suffering. And when a society doesn't understand something, it has two choices. Try to help it or turn it into entertainment. Bethlem chose both, in that order, and leaned hard into the second one. Here's the detail that should genuinely unsettle you. The hospital kept the money. Multiply a penny by tens of thousands of visitors a year, plus the larger holiday crowds who paid more, and you get an institution generating hundreds of pounds annually, profiting directly from the display of illness, not the treatment of it. And none of this was hidden. This wasn't a scandal someone had to dig up later. For nearly a century, Bethlem sat on the exact same social itinerary as the Tower of London and St. Paul's Cathedral. It was in the guidebooks. It was simply the done thing. Viewing grates in the doors, Corridors wide enough to move crowds through quickly. Entrances built to handle heavy foot traffic. This wasn't a hospital that accidentally became a spectacle. It was built brick by brick around the act of being watched. So that's the what. A building, a penny, a crowd, but what isn't the disturbing part? What happens inside those cells to real, documented, named people is where this turns from uncomfortable to genuinely hard to watch. In 1800, an American sailor named James Norris was brought into Bethlem. The exact circumstances of his admission aren't fully documented. What is documented in devastating detail is what happened to him after. After a violent incident with a member of staff, Norris was fitted with a custom iron harness, a collar around his neck, iron bars pinning his arms to his sides, a chain barely long enough to let him reach the edge of his own bed. And then, nothing. No review, no reassessment. Just years. For over a decade, James Norris existed like this, restrained, isolated in what the hospital labeled the incurable ward. A label that, once applied, meant nobody was coming back to check on you. Then in 1814, a reformer named Edward Wakefield walked through, and he found Norris, still chained, still restrained, 14 years later. Here's the detail that should genuinely surprise you. When word got out, 6 separate members of Parliament came to see Norris for themselves. Every single one of them reported the same thing, that he was calm, rational, capable of holding a normal, coherent conversation. The system hadn't just failed to cure him. It had spent 14 years restraining a man who, by every account, didn't need to be restrained at all. When Norris was finally released from his restraints in 1814, his body had already given out. He died within weeks. Pneumonia, most likely, worsened by over a decade in that position. He never got to experience what his own freedom actually looked like. And here's what connects this back to the spectacle. For most of the years Norris was chained to that post, visitors were still walking these same corridors, penny in hand, looking in through grates, just like his. Restraint wasn't the only method on offer either. Reform-era testimony describes cold bathing as a shock treatment. A patient dropped without warning through a trapdoor into freezing water below. The theory was that the shock might jolt the mind back into balance. In practice, it mostly just terrified people who were already suffering. We have a documented case, a named man, 14 years, 6 members of Parliament as witnesses. That's disturbing enough on its own. But it doesn't answer the question we opened with. Why the audience kept showing up, and it doesn't answer who was actually running this place and letting it happen for generations. For nearly 90 years, from 1728 to 1815, Bethlem wasn't run by a rotating cast of doctors. It was run by one family, the Monros. James Monro took the post in 1728, his son John in 1751, his son Thomas in 1787. 4 generations treating London's madness as a family trade, passed down like a title, not earned through competition. So while James Norris sat chained to a post for 14 years, the man ultimately responsible for his care was Thomas Monro, 3rd in the family line. When the 1815 inquiry asked Monro how often he actually attended to patients, the answer was damning. He came to the hospital only a few times a week and mostly saw whoever the apothecary happened to flag for him. Not the patients who needed him most, whoever got flagged. For nearly a century, one family had held a near monopoly on treating madness in the most powerful city on earth. And the appointment had nothing to do with medicine. It had to do with being born into the right last name. So now we know who was profiting from the visitors' pennies and who was overseeing the chains. But we still haven't answered the bigger question: why the aristocracy themselves considered this a perfectly respectable way to spend an afternoon. Picture this. You're a member of London's high society. This week you've been to the opera, you've had tea at a friend's townhouse, and tomorrow you're planning a trip to Bedlam, not out of concern, out of interest. We know this happened because they wrote it down in personal diaries, with the exact same casual tone they'd use for the theatre. It even made it onto the stage. Playwrights built entire comic scenes around asylum visits because audiences found it funny. How does a society convince itself that watching human suffering is culture? It doesn't take much convincing at all, not if the people suffering are already considered beneath you. And the royal connection to this story runs deeper than you'd think. In 1786, Margaret Nicholson approached King George III outside St. James's Palace and tried to stab him with a dessert knife. Barely broke skin. She was never tried, simply declared insane and committed to Bethlem for the rest of her life. No jury, no sentence, over 40 years until she died there in 1828. 14 years later, it happened again, and this time it changed the law itself. James Hadfield, a former soldier with a saber wound to the head, fired a pistol at George III inside the Drury Lane Theatre. His lawyer argued the head injury left him delusional, convinced that killing the king would trigger the second coming. The court agreed. He was acquitted. Parliament was furious, so they rushed through the Criminal Lunatics Act of 1800, creating a new category, not guilty by reason of insanity, followed immediately by indefinite detention. Hadfield spent the next 4 decades inside Bethlem. The same institution holding a man who tried to assassinate the king was, at the very same time, selling penny tickets to watch people exactly like him suffer for entertainment. Justice and spectacle operating under one roof. We've covered who was watching and why society let them, but what the doctors themselves were doing in the name of treatment is arguably more disturbing than the chains. Let's be clear. The doctors running these institutions weren't cartoonish villains twirling mustaches. Many of them genuinely believed they were advancing medicine. That belief is exactly what makes this next part so unsettling. Take the rotational chair. The theory, popular in this era, was that mental illness came from disrupted blood flow to the brain. So the solution? Strap a patient in, spin them, sometimes for minutes at a time, until they vomited or lost consciousness, or both. On paper, it wasn't punishment. It was disorientation as therapy, the belief that violently scrambling the senses might somehow reset them. It didn't. It just added physical trauma on top of whatever the patient was already carrying. None of this was secret or shameful within the profession at the time. It was published, debated, considered legitimate cutting-edge medicine, and it's worth pausing on one particular patient here, because his story complicates the whole picture. Richard Dadd was a genuinely talented painter before he killed his own father, convinced the man was the devil in disguise. He spent the rest of his life inside Bethlem and kept painting the entire time. Some of the most detailed, celebrated artwork of the era produced from inside a locked ward. So even inside a system built on chains, cold water, and spinning chairs, human beings kept finding ways to create something that doesn't excuse the system. If anything, it makes the waste of it more obvious. Chains, cold water, spinning chairs, patients treated like exhibits. At some point, this had to end. The question is what finally forced the change, and whether the instinct behind all of this actually went away or just found a new shape. The beginning of the end started with exactly what we saw in Scene 4, Edward Wakefield's 1814 discovery of James Norris. and the parliamentary inquiry it triggered the following year. That image of Norris, chained and silent, is what finally forced people who'd never set foot in Bethlem to reckon with what their penny had actually been buying. The fallout reached all the way to the top. In 1815, Thomas Monro, the third generation of his family to run the hospital, was forced out of his position in direct response to what the inquiry uncovered. 90 years of one family's rule over London's madness ended, not because they lost an election, but because the evidence finally became impossible to ignore. Public visiting hours were shut down. The idea of paying to watch patients suffer, treated as completely normal for over a century, was suddenly recognized for exactly what it always was. What followed was a slow shift toward what reformers called moral treatment, the idea that patients might respond better to structure, dignity, and calm than to chains and cold water. It wasn't an instant fix, but it was, finally, a different question being asked. It's tempting to look at all of this and feel safely distant from it, like it belongs entirely to the past. And what does it say about us that some part of that instinct never actually went away? We don't pay a penny at a gate anymore. But we do stream documentaries about people's worst days. We do binge true crime cases built entirely around someone else's suffering. The format changed. The instinct to watch, to be entertained by someone else's darkest moment, never fully disappeared. It just moved indoors, onto a screen, and got a lot more comfortable to access. James Norris died within weeks of being freed. Margaret Nicholson spent over 40 years behind those walls without ever standing trial. James Hadfield spent 4 decades there after changing the entire legal definition of insanity. And for most of that time, someone was standing on the other side of a grate, penny in hand, just watching. That's the story of Bedlam, not a story about madness. A story about what a society is willing to call entertainment, and who it decides doesn't get a say in the matter. If this kind of history is your thing, you know where the next door leads. I'll see you there.